2 hours ago, in a coordinated announcement that central bank governors, finance ministers, and currency traders had not seen coming despite 18 months of watching this confrontation build, Canada signed a framework agreement in Ottawa with the United Kingdom, the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, establishing the first Western-led alternative settlement system for trade in critical resources, energy, minerals, and agricultural commodities, that explicitly operates outside the United States dollar. The framework is called the Allied Resource Settlement Arrangement. It is not a new currency. It is not a cryptocurrency. It is a multilateral clearing mechanism, a system under which participating nations settle trade in a weighted basket of their own currencies, with exchange rates managed through a coordinating committee hosted at the Bank of International Settlements in Basel. The BIS has been quietly providing technical support to the framework's design process for 11 months. The announcement from Basel confirming the BIS's technical role came 40 minutes after Ottawa's signing ceremony. It was the confirmation that converted financial market skepticism into repricing. The trigger for today's announcement was Washington's decision this morning to invoke the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act to threaten secondary sanctions against any nation that allows Canadian entities to use American correspondent banking infrastructure to settle resource trades, while Canada maintains what Washington characterizes as uncooperative trade postures. The threat was designed to isolate Canada from dollar-denominated trade by making Canadian resource exports too legally risky for third-country banks to handle. It was the most aggressive financial pressure Washington had applied in this confrontation. And it was the trigger Carney had been waiting for. Washington's name for this strategy inside planning documents: reserve pressure. The dollar is the world's reserve currency. Every nation that trades internationally depends on access to dollar-denominated clearing. Threaten that access, and Canada has nowhere to go. Reserve pressure was the strategy that the administration considered its ultimate lever, the one that had no counter because the dollar has no substitute. Mark Carney spent 14 years as a central banker before he became a prime minister. He ran the Bank of Canada through the 2008 financial crisis. He ran the Bank of England through Brexit. He knows, with a precision that very few people alive possess, exactly what the dollar's dominance is built on, where its vulnerabilities are, and what it would take to create a credible alternative clearing mechanism for a specific category of trade. He has known for 30 years that the answer to those questions is not ideology. It is architecture. Build the architecture and the alternative becomes real. He spent 14 months building the architecture. The Allied Resource Settlement Arrangement covers 3 commodity categories: energy, crude oil, natural gas, uranium, and hydroelectric power; critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, nickel, potash, and rare earth elements; and agricultural commodities, wheat, canola, soybeans, and processed food products. These are the specific categories in which Canada is a major global supplier, in which the participating nations are major buyers, and in which dollar-denominated settlement was the default not because of any intrinsic necessity, but because of historical convention and the absence of a credible alternative. The framework's first operational day will settle approximately $4.2 billion in resource trades between Canada and the 6 participating nations. That figure will grow as additional bilateral supply agreements route through the new system. The framework has been designed to accommodate up to $800 billion in annual trade volume at full implementation, a figure that represents a significant share of the global resource trade that currently settles in dollars. Carney appeared at the signing ceremony flanked by the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, the EU Trade Commissioner, Japan's Finance Minister, South Korea's Finance Minister, and Australia's Treasurer. 6 nations, 7 finance officials, 1 document. And behind them, on a screen visible to the cameras, a single line of text: Allied Resource Settlement Arrangement, effective today. He spoke for 7 minutes. He did not use the word retaliation. He did not use the word anti-American. He used the word architecture 14 times. The dollar's role as the world's reserve currency rests on a single foundation: trust that the United States will not weaponize its financial system against its allies. That trust has been systematically undermined over 18 months of sanctions threats, asset freezes, and financial coercion directed at nations that have done nothing except decline to accept terms they were not consulted on. We are not leaving the dollar. We are building a complementary system for a specific category of trade where dollar settlement is no longer a neutral infrastructure. It has become a pressure instrument. We are removing the pressure instrument. Then he announced 4 operational elements of the framework that revealed the depth of preparation behind it. The first element, the Bank of Canada, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of Korea, and the Reserve Bank of Australia, have collectively established a $240 billion liquidity facility to ensure that the RSA clearing mechanism has sufficient capitalization to handle daily settlement volumes without dependence on American correspondent banking. The liquidity facility was funded before today's announcement. The 6 central banks had been quietly building their respective contributions for 9 months. The facility does not need American approval to operate. It does not route through American financial infrastructure. It clears through Basel. The second element was the one that made the Federal Reserve issue an internal brief within 90 minutes of the announcement. The framework includes a currency stabilization mechanism, a set of predetermined intervention triggers that prevent exchange rate volatility between participating currencies from disrupting the settlement system. The mechanism was designed by the same team of economists who built the European exchange rate mechanism in the 1990s, refined with the lessons of that system's 1992 collapse, and stress-tested against 7 decades of commodity price data. It is technically sophisticated, politically neutral, and explicitly modeled to avoid the vulnerabilities that made previous dollar alternative systems fail. The Federal Reserve brief, which was described to financial media by 2 people familiar with its contents, reportedly concluded that the stabilization mechanism was more robustly designed than any previous non-dollar settlement proposal. But this is where the framework reveals something that goes far beyond a bilateral trade dispute. The third element, the framework is explicitly open to accession by any nation that is a member of the WTO, maintains a freely convertible currency, and agrees to the framework's governance structure. It is not a closed club. It is an open architecture with published technical specifications, transparent governance, and a formal accession process. Canada has already received formal expressions of interest from Norway, Switzerland, New Zealand, and Chile. India has requested observer status. Brazil has requested a bilateral consultation on accession terms. The framework that began as a response to American financial pressure is becoming something the architects of American financial hegemony have feared for 30 years. A credible, Western-designed, rule-of-law governed alternative to dollar dominance for a specific and significant category of global trade. The fourth element closed the announcement with a precision that the room received in silence. Canada is immediately converting 40% of its foreign exchange reserves, currently held predominantly in U.S. Treasury instruments, into a diversified basket of ARSA participating nation currencies and gold. The conversion will occur over 90 days through the Bank of Canada's normal reserve management operations, which do not require Treasury notification and which are fully within Canada's sovereign authority over its own reserve management. The dollar value of Canadian reserves being converted, approximately $68 billion. The signal value of the conversion, immeasurable. When a G7 central bank publicly announces reserve diversification away from U.S. Treasuries, every other central bank's reserve management committee begins a conversation it was previously reluctant to have publicly. The market reaction was the most significant single-session dollar movement since the 2008 financial crisis, not because of the immediate volume of trade shifting away from dollar settlement, but because of what the framework's existence signals about the future trajectory of that volume. The dollar index fell against the euro, the pound, the yen, and the Canadian dollar simultaneously. Gold surged. U.S. Treasury yields rose as investors priced in reduced foreign central bank demand for American sovereign debt. The moves were not catastrophic. They were precise, directional, and durable. The kind of repricing that does not reverse when a news cycle changes because it is based on a structural change in the architecture of global trade settlement, not on a sentiment shift. JPMorgan's global currency team issued a client note within 2 hours describing the ARSA framework as the first credible Western-designed dollar alternative settlement mechanism in the post-Bretton Woods era. Goldman Sachs's commodities team published an analysis noting that if ARSA reaches 20% of global resource trade volume, a figure the framework's design capacity supports, the structural demand for dollar-denominated settlement in commodity markets falls by an amount that would require significant adjustment in Treasury's long-term financing assumptions. The Council on Foreign Relations published an emergency commentary describing the day as potentially the most significant development in international monetary architecture since the Nixon shock of 1971. The American political reaction reflected the seriousness with which the financial community was treating the announcement. The chair of the Senate Banking Committee, a Republican, called for an emergency hearing on the ARSA framework and its implications for dollar reserve currency status. The chair of the House Financial Services Committee announced a joint investigation with the Senate into the administration's use of CAATSA secondary sanctions threats against allied nations. Former Federal Reserve chairs, including figures who have not spoken publicly on policy matters in years, issued statements expressing concern about the acceleration of dollar alternatives in allied nations. The international response was the one that Washington had feared most and prepared least for. The framework's 6 founding members represent the United States' closest allies: the UK, the EU, Japan, South Korea, Australia. These are not adversaries building an alternative to American power. These are partners who have concluded that American financial coercion has become unpredictable enough to warrant architectural protection. That conclusion, reached simultaneously by 6 allied governments and announced jointly in Ottawa, is the data point that every remaining dollar-dependent nation will now incorporate into its own reserve and trade settlement planning. Trump has 3 paths, and for the first time in this confrontation, all 3 lead to the same destination: a world in which the ARSA framework exists, operates, and grows. Maintain the CAATSA secondary sanctions threats and provide every nation currently evaluating ARSA accession with the justification to accelerate that evaluation. The framework was built as a response to American financial coercion. Continued coercion is the framework's most effective marketing. Rescind the sanctions threats, but the framework's $240 billion liquidity facility is capitalized. The BIS technical support is active. The 6 founding members have signed. The accession process for additional members is open. ARSA does not require the sanctions threat to remain in effect in order to continue operating. It was built to outlast the specific dispute that triggered it. Engage diplomatically and negotiate from a position in which 6 allied nations have already built the architecture of an alternative, and in which the man leading the negotiation for the other side designed central bank frameworks for a living before he entered politics. 2 hours ago, Washington deployed its ultimate financial lever, the threat to cut Canada off from the dollar system that underpins global trade. 2 hours later, Canada has launched a dollar alternative settlement framework with 6 allied nations, capitalized by 6 central banks, supported by the BIS, open to accession by any WTO member, and already attracting interest from India, Brazil, Norway, Switzerland, and Chile. Reserve pressure assumed there was no reserve alternative. Carney spent 14 months building one. And the man who built it is the former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, the person on earth best qualified to know exactly what an alternative needs to be credible, and exactly what it takes to build credibility that lasts beyond a news cycle. Washington wanted to weaponize the dollar. Carney just made the dollar optional for a category of trade that moves hundreds of billions annually. That is not retaliation. That is architecture. And architecture, unlike executive orders, does not expire.